What's up, primates? Thank you for tuning in whenever it is that you tune in. It looks like at the time that I am beginning this stream, nobody's tuned in, and that's okay because this is most likely going to stay up. If it isn't, then I guess you won't be listening to me. I will have taken it down. So if you're listening right now in the future, you know that this was at least a good enough stream for me to not feel like taking it down. So that much I can at least assure you. So you might have read by the title, assumed by reading the title, I should say, of this video, of this stream, that I'm going to be inquiring about the morality and rationality of suicide. I want to begin this stream by taking a minute to give the trigger warning, though I think I put it in the title. I will give it again now, that while this isn't going to be an effort to talk anyone into suicide, it is also not necessarily going to be an effort to talk anybody out of it. It is rather a philosophical inquiry pertaining to the rationality and morality of suicide, or irrationality and immorality. I personally hold that there isn't some solid answer about morality or irrationality that would apply to every given individual. I think whether or not one person could be morally obligated not to kill themselves, that obligation might not extend to everybody else. They might be obligated for their own set of reasons, say people being dependent on them, and some other person might either not have any reasons or have some other reasons why they're obligated not to make that hard decision if they feel like making it. I should also kind of state here in the beginning that I'm aware that this stream probably has a very high potential for people to be concerned. This could cause people to think that I'm sitting here thinking about suicide myself. And in order to discuss suicide, of course, I am thinking about the topic of suicide, but I want to take some worry off of anyone who might be considering that I might be, making that decision myself after this stream or something like that. That isn't something you need to worry about. I'm actually not in a very dark place right now. I've been going through some difficult times recently, but I'm not currently contemplating suicide. I won't say that I never have, but I'm not at the moment. I'm making an inquiry philosophically about it. So please, if you're tuning in worried that I might perhaps be leaning that way, if that's why you're tuned in and you're making sure there's something to be concerned of or not be concerned of, there's your answer now. So if you would like to save yourself from being bored by my philosophical inquiry, this is my opportunity to let you know it's all good. You can tune out now if it's not for you. If you're somebody who's experiencing suicidal thoughts, ideation, I think ideation is a word. I'm just going to assume ideation is a word. If you're somebody who is currently considering suicide, and when I say currently, I mean like you're in a dark place right now, my advice to you would be to pause this stream, come back to it some other time. I'm not saying don't ever watch it, but rather watch it when you're not in such a dark place. I would like to advise anyone who is currently in a dark place and not only thinking about suicide as a topic, but contemplating it themselves, please watch this video some other time. I know I won't be able to stop everybody, if there are a few people in that situation. I am here for you if you want to talk, reach out to me via Facebook Messenger, get on the Atheist Network group, Discord server, reach out, say you want to get a hold of me. I am there to talk to people about what it is they're going through and their ideas on it. So want to put that out there in the beginning. So in respect to the morality portion of this inquiry, I'm going to be referencing an article from the Stanford Encyclopedia. I could link that in the comments of the description after the fact. So we're going to be looking at an article in the Stanford Encyclopedia pertaining to the morality of suicide. Really some notes that I took on it, and I'm really just going to be scratching the surface today. So maybe in the future, if this stream goes well, I'll make another one. But then when we get to the rationality portion of this conversation, what I'm going to be reviewing is a lecture given by a professor at Yale University. And I should state that I have actually seen this lecture in the past, but it's been like 2 years. So I don't really remember the points that he was making entirely. So I will be revisiting those ideas live. As for the morality portion, let's just get started right now, right there. Normally, I try to memorize a script or something like that in my videos. The thing about a stream is there's going to be a little bit less work into it. I'm just going to be reading off of the notes that I took. So, I don't know if it bothers you that my eyes aren't facing the camera directly the whole time or something like that. I don't know. Sorry, not really. But let's begin with the principal moral issue surrounding suicide. So the principal moral issue surrounding the topic of suicide has been the following question: are there conditions under which suicide is morally justified? And if so, which conditions? This question should be distinguished from three others. So we're going to talk about three questions that we are not asking right now. These three questions are: should other individuals attempt to prevent suicide? Should the state criminalize suicide or attempt to prevent it? And is suicide ever rational or prudent? So those are three questions that we are not referring to right now. Again, the question is, are there conditions under which suicide is morally justified? And if so, which conditions? Speaking of dying, though, my computer's dying. I need to charge it. Let me plug that in real quick. Oh, man. This might be in the top 3 unprofessional moments of my live streams, but hey, that's authenticity. If I pretend to be professional despite not being professional, I'm just being inauthentic at some point. I'm allowed to just be purely authentic today. Okay. So that question: are there conditions under which suicide is morally justified? Then it's really 2 questions, because if there are conditions under which suicide is morally justified, then what are those conditions? So the first observation to make about this question is that it seems to presuppose that suicide is immoral by default, and this I seem to have a problem with. Sure, telling people that they have an obligation to continue living when they desire not to may potentially pressure them through the means of guilt into not ending their life upon their immediate desire. But if we're to hold this principle that suicide is immoral by default, then we are necessarily compelled to view the majority of those who have taken their life with blame or disdain. It also raises the question of whether or not a life lived for no reason other than mere guilt is really a life worth living. And we'll get back to that. So I find that it isn't, but I hold that if one is in this position of living for no reason other than guilt, that rather than ending one's own life, one should begin to assign meaning to be fulfilled. So in other words, I'm willing to grant the person who's suicidal and only wishes to live because they feel guilt-tripped out of suicide that perhaps it may be the case that their life is lacking in meaning. And that's a statement that I expect to be very controversial. And I'm, you know what? I'm not going to blame anybody who takes controversy with that. That is a reasonable thing for people to consider. The idea that I'm proposing is that if somebody is suicidal and the only reason they are living is because they're guilt-tripped out of suicide, pay attention to my words here. Perhaps it may be the case that their life is lacking in meaning. That is all I said, that it might be lacking in meaning. But I don't think that being in the position of living a meaningless life means that one should go end their life, but rather that since their life lacks meaning, they should exercise their freedom of assigning meaning from scratch. So for those of you who don't know, I am an optimistic nihilist. I don't even really like wording it in the sense of, life has no meaning. I think that's an understandable way to look at what the word nihilism means. When I say I'm a nihilist, what I really mean is that life's meaning is not intrinsic. So in clarity, I would just say that life has no intrinsic or objective meaning. That doesn't mean that we can't assign meaning, and I don't think that the fact that meaning is something that we assign is as problematic as people make it out to be. So if there is no meaning to life, I cannot make sense of the idea that there is meaning to suicide. Intrinsic meaning to suicide presupposes intrinsic meaning to life, which I simply don't believe in. I find that the meaninglessness of life provides us with the opportunity to assign meaning to what we wish, and I find that to be an incredibly beautiful thing. So, examples of things I consider to be worth assigning meaning to are friendships, love, productivity, wisdom, and travel. So, to briefly elaborate on that, I assign meaning to productivity in the sense that, you have, for example, one small example would be the job that I have. I stock the shelves at a grocery store. One of the things that brings meaning to my life is knowing that other people are able to get food off of a shelf at a grocery store because of the fact that I'm doing my job. Doesn't make me a hero. It's just that I'm taking on a role that contributes to society and benefits me, and that I get paid to do it, right? And volunteer work, you even better produce, finding meaning in productivity. So if you're looking for a purpose or you're looking for meaning, I would recommend looking into volunteer work. You will find a lot of meaning if you realize that you have this ability to help others and that you can pursue that. Because you shouldn't only be working for money. I can't tell anybody else what to do, but if you're suicidal to any degree and you aren't doing any charity work or any volunteer work of any kind, I would strongly urge you to get into volunteer work. Not only is it the case that you may find people that you may build relationships with, and those relationships may give you more meaning to life, but in being productive itself, you're probably going to find meaning in that. Wisdom. This isn't going to pertain to everybody. I find a lot of meaning in wisdom. I derive pleasure from it. I am, sometimes studying can be boring, but when I know a lot of things, there is this satisfactory feeling of attaining information, of attaining, intelligence, wisdom. So that is something worth living for me. I listed travel as well. There are more places in this world than I'm ever going to live to see. And I'm fortunate enough to be, at the time of this stream, I'm only 23 years old. I'm young. And so hopefully it is the case that within my life, I get to pursue a lot of travel. And I think that I will. I think that is an relatively easily achievable goal. So assigning meaning to life in the means of travel and wisdom and productivity, love. I cannot decide to love or not love, but what it is that I experience with, the label that I have love, because, people might ask you, what does love mean? And that raises an entire philosophical discussion in itself. But I find a lot of meaning in love. And though people that we love are going to go, more people that we are going to love are going to come. You should consider at the time of this stream that it may be the case that the best friend that you ever have, or the best love that you ever have intimately within your life, it may be the case that you haven't met that person yet. So somebody that is going to become your best friend at the time that you're listening to this, maybe they're at the gym or they're at work or they're doing whatever. But you don't even know them yet. And I think that's something that not a lot of us really pause and stop and think about, right? So friendships, I would put friendships as a subcategory of love. Love could include friendships and intimate relationships. It would include the relationships that you have with people like family members. So that is a part of life that I think you could assign meaning to. And again, you assign meaning to these things, then you can fulfill that meaning. If you have a lot of value in friendships, but then you feel like, oh, well, now that makes me more suicidal because I'm lacking friends. Well, now this is an opportunity to go figure out some more ways to achieve friendships. And I'm autistic, so I understand that some people simply have a very difficult time making friends. And that's one of the things that we're trying to do on the Atheist Network. For those of you who don't know, I joined a community called the Atheist Network Group. We're here for you. So if you're somebody who, even if you're not an atheist, if you're listening to this stream, you're probably somebody that I would want to talk to. So if you're listening to this stream and you're lacking in friendships, please try to get a hold of me through Messenger on Facebook, or try to join the Atheist Network Group Discord server. Get in touch with me if you could figure out how to. I'm not really that hard to get a hold of. And there's community, and I don't just become friends with me. I mean, I could probably introduce you to some other people, but I'll do my part, right? Friendships are one of the things that give life meaning, but they're only one of the things. There are a lot of small, simple things, and I probably should have wrote that down. I'm glad I remembered it. You have to remember to assign meaning to the small things in life. Otherwise, you're not going to be satisfied very often. So that's some important note right there. Let me see. Still 0 viewers at the time. Well, that's fine with me. I don't need anybody to be watching live. Hopefully, a few people will check this out after the fact. So, going back to the initial question. Oh, and it's like 2 a.m, so I'm not surprised that nobody's listening, by the way. So going back to the initial question, and that was, are there conditions under which suicide is morally justified? And if so, which conditions? Well, I find that in many cases, when one doesn't have others depending on them, it may very well be morally permissible for them to take their own life. But that we shouldn't assume that an act being morally permissible entails that a person should therefore commit the act. So, for example, it would be morally permissible for me to go count every blade of grass in a park, but that doesn't mean that I should necessarily do it. And it's still possible for us to say that other reasons, for other reasons not pertaining to morality, I shouldn't go do that. So if you want to say that I shouldn't go count every blade of grass in a field, you're probably not saying I shouldn't do it because it's immoral, but there's some other reason why I shouldn't go do that, right? It's a waste of my time. There's no instrumental value to me knowing how many blades of grass are in a field at a park. There's no point. And so the only point that I'm making here is, if you arrive at the conclusion, and it's a logical conclusion, that it is morally permissible for you to kill yourself, that doesn't provide a reason for you to do so, right? It just means that it's morally permissible. There are all kinds of things that are morally permissible that you shouldn't do for other reasons having nothing to do with morality. So it's a little bit harder to justify my position from my worldview, not being a deontologist, because if you are a deontologist, then you could simply say that there are duties that exist objectively in life. And one of those duties, the biggest one would be, of course, that you have to live. So it might be a lot easier for people to justify saying that you shouldn't kill yourself if they come from a deontological position. But I don't come from a deontological position. I don't think that there exists any factual, objective, duties in any way, shape, or form. So of course I wouldn't believe that there are duties to not kill oneself, especially since I consider there to be situations in which it would be a better decision for a person to make in respect to their own experience. And this actually does slowly transition us into the rationality aspect. We're not exactly there yet. I want to ask people to consider what I call, in respect to the suicide discussion, the 9/11 scenario. And when I bring this up, what I'm referring to is, September 11th, the plane crashed into a building. You had people above the part of the building in which the plane crashed, right? They're stuck in a building that is inevitably going to fall down, right? So prior to any of those people who were, the ones who were above the plane, they have no chance of getting out. Elevators, stairs, all blocked. They're just going to be sitting in that building, suffering from heat, smoke, being unable to breathe, fear, until they die. And many people started jumping out. Many people started killing themselves. I would argue that if you were in that position, who would anybody be to tell you that you were doing something immoral by jumping out the window to kill yourself when you were going to die in another 10 minutes anyway? Why should you be obligated to go through 10 more minutes of unnecessary suffering, 10 more minutes of you having a hard time breathing, being in heat, being in fear? It's a really horrible spot that those people were in. I think personally, the people who jumped from the building were making the most rational decision. And that isn't to say that the people who weren't jumping were irrational. They were just, clinging to life. Maybe they were hoping to make it out somehow. And again, I did give a trigger warning. I knew there would be some depressing aspects of this conversation. It's a conversation about suicide. If you didn't expect anything depressing to come up, I don't know what to tell you, really. But that's the case. I think that the people who jumped from the building because they weren't possibly going to survive, that's one of the best examples I could think of it being rational to kill yourself. I think most people who feel that they should be killing themselves are probably not actually in that position. But I think it's a lot more validating to let a suicidal person know, if you're going to tell someone who's suicidal that there's no such thing as a situation in which they would be better off dead than alive. I mean, if you want to say there's no such thing as that existing, I don't know if you're intellectually honest. I could tell you that to that suicidal person, you're not going to come off as honest or convincing. I find it very unlikely. So that's one approach to it. So one of the problems with deontology in respect to this conversation is, or I guess I might have left off a point that I meant to make there. And the last point, if you admit that there is such thing as circumstances in which a person could be better off dead than alive, then you might have better grounds to talk to a person about whether or not they are in one of those circumstances. If I felt like killing myself and you just told me nobody should ever do it, that doesn't really mean that much to me. But if you were to tell me, okay, well, you're right, there is such thing as circumstances in which a person would be better off taking their life than not, then I'm already, you're going to be able to work with me, ground with me. You're going to be able to reason with me on a better level than if you then go explaining, well, no, you're not in one of those positions according to some unspecified criteria. And I'm like, okay, maybe you're right. Maybe according to this inquiry, I shouldn't be doing this. And that's important, right? But another problem with deontology, again, a lot of people feel like deontology saves people from suicide. I strongly disagree with that. One of the reasons why is because a man named John Hardwig has argued that sometimes the burdens that a person imposes on others, particularly family members or loved ones, by continuing to live, are sufficiently great that one may have a duty to die in order to relieve them of these burdens. So deontology makes the case for a duty to die, right? So Hardwig's argument thus seems to turn not on the overall balance of costs and benefits that result from a person living or dying, but on the fairness of the burdens that a person imposes on others by continuing to live. This is a common feeling or view among people who are suicidal. They often feel that they would be making the world a better place by not being in it, and thus taking the burdens they pose on others off of them. But in almost all cases where this is felt, the family member or friends in question would be given a much heavier burden of grief upon the death of this person who they love enough to be taken care of in the first place. That's more, this is really getting to more of my own opinions, but this is philosophy. That's going to happen. So that's a tough topic for people, right? But if you consider what I'm saying is, if you are a person who poses burdens to other people, and that exists, let's admit it, there are people who are posing burdens to people. If somebody's taking care of you and that is what is posing burdens on them, you must consider the burden of grief that you would be causing them if you took your life. So if you're going off the burdens you would be placing on other people, then you're most likely going to arrive at, if you apply logic, that is, you're going to arrive at, no, you shouldn't do this because you would be burdening someone more by killing yourself. So, some doubt that the duty of beneficence to which Hardwig appeals justifies anything stronger than a permission to take one's own life when continuing to live is burdensome to others. Others worry that a moral requirement to engage in suicide raises the sinister and totalitarian prospect that individuals may be obligated to engage in suicide against their wishes. This is what we have to take into consideration, because if you go to make that argument, you are now arguing that there may be people who actually don't even desire to kill themselves, but they may be obligated to do so simply because they're posing burdens on others. But I feel that if you have a person who poses burdens on others, but they are not suicidal, and other people do not want them to commit suicide, then you lack a reason to say that that person should go commit suicide, right? You haven't justified why they should kill themselves. You haven't. So, in respect to the morality of suicide, I would leave it at, generally speaking, it is morally permissible for somebody to commit suicide as long as they do not have others depending on them. And many people do have other people depending on them. But then I would remind you that just because something is morally permissible does not mean that therefore you should go do it. Again, it's morally permissible for me to go count every blade of grass in a park. That doesn't mean that I should therefore go do it. So I feel like a lot of people are going to make that mistake. When I say it's morally permissible, they're going to say I'm saying that people should go do it. Not arguing that. But that was, I just wanted to scratch the surface on morality. So there we are for the morality of suicide. But that brings us to the second portion of this inquiry, and that is going to be on the rationality of suicide. Now, as I stated earlier, pertaining to the rationality of suicide, I'm going to be reviewing a lecture from Yale University. I watched this lecture a long time ago. I hardly remember what it was about. So I'm just going to be playing through it, reviewing it, and seeing what my thoughts are on it. So let's get into it now.
Now, once again, the first thing I want to do in thinking about the rationality of suicide is to distinguish two different issues or two different questions. First question is going to be this: when, if ever, would it be true that you are better off dead? Could it be the case that, sort of your life is going so badly that you'd be better off dead? Second question: assuming that the answer to the first question is under such and such circumstances you would be better off dead, we still have to ask, could it ever be rational for you to trust your judgment that this is one of those cases in which you're better off dead? Could it ever be rational for you to kill yourself? Conceivably, the answer to the second might be no.
All right, so I'm going to give it a quick pause there and stop and think about it. So he said, ask yourself, could there be such thing as a situation in which a person would be better off dead than alive? I already kind of started getting at that with the 9/11 example. So we should look at what are some of the conditions that make up it being the case that a person could be rationally justified in taking their life. I think if they are in a circumstance in which they know that to continue living is going to entail overall more suffering than pleasure, that it would be rational for them. Since I go off of a pleasure-based moral system, I'm a utilitarian. I find that the meaning to life is pleasure and the avoidance of suffering. So according to my own philosophy, at least, if you are in a situation where you know that continuing to live is going to entail more suffering than pleasure, and significantly more suffering, because if it's a little bit more suffering, but there's still plenty of pleasure, that raises a lot more questions. But if you're going to be purely suffering for another, in the 9/11 example, maybe you have another 10 minutes an hour, since you don't know where you're at, right? If you know you're going to be dying soon and you're just suffering, then I think it would be rational for you in that circumstance to discontinue living. But why, discontinue putting yourself through that suffering. So let's see what else there is to add to this. What else does he say?
All right, so the question was this. It's conceivable that you might have the thought like the following. In those circumstances in which life has gotten so horrible that you'd be better off dead, you can't think clearly. And the very fact that you can't think clearly would entail that you shouldn't trust your judgment that you are in one of those cases. Whether that's a good argument or not is something we'll have to turn to later, but it's because of the possibility of that argument that I wanted to distinguish the initial question, could it be true that you're better off dead, from the secondary question, even if it could be true that you're better off dead, could it ever be a reasonable or rational decision for you to believe that you're in one of those situations? Unless we've got the two things in place, it doesn't seem likely that it's ever going to be rational to commit suicide. So the very first topic we have to look at is, could it ever be true that you'd be better off dead? And immediately, there's a kind of logical worry that may occur to some of you, certainly has been raised by various philosophers. And that's to say that the very judgment, the very claim that Jones would be better off dead can't make any sense. On the assumption that, look, in order to make comparisons, better off, worse off, here he is in such and such a situation, he'd be better off in that other situation, you've got to be able to talk about, on the one hand, what condition or state the person is before, and what condition or state the person would be in afterwards if they were to make that choice. Call this the two-state requirement.
Okay, now my memory is refreshed because I do recall the two-state requirement, and this is probably where I first learned of it. So in case you didn't understand by listening to him explain it, if you want to figure out whether or not you would be better off dead, better off alive, what you're doing is making a comparison, right? Well, in order to make a comparison, you must necessarily meet the two-state requirement. You must have two states to be able to compare, right? So this raises a few problems, especially if you're coming from a worldview like mine, where you do not believe in there being an afterlife. If you're somebody like myself who believes that consciousness and life, that these are the products of, material things in the universe, and that's the view that I hold, then you can actually figure out how to say that you might have a hard time at least figuring out how to say that you could be better off dead, because what you're doing is you're saying that you would be better off in this, state than you are in the current one. The problem is, if I'm correct in my presumption that life ends when the brain stops working, then if I was the person who was deeply suicidal, hypothetically speaking, because again, clarity, I'm not contemplating it right now, but if I was the person in this circumstance, and I see that somebody else just joined the stream, I got 2 viewers. Shout outs to both of you. Thank you for tuning in. Just a quick philosophical inquiry. This is nothing to be concerned about. So I want to replay what he said because it was pretty important. The two-state requirement here. So we're going to go back.
The very claim that Jones would be better off dead can't make any sense. On the assumption that, look, in order to make comparisons, better off, worse off, here he is in such and such a situation, he'd be better off in that other situation, you've got to be able to talk about, on the one hand, what condition or state the person is before, and what condition or state the person would be in afterwards.
Okay, so that's to put it quite simply, if you're somebody like myself who doesn't believe in an afterlife, then in order for you to consider whether or not you could be better off dead, what you would have to do is you would have to be able to compare the state that you're in right now, living, with the state that you would be in while dead. But if you don't believe in an afterlife, then what you are granting from that is that death is not a state, right? You're not being, there is no state to be compared to the state that you're in right now. So how could you possibly justify, from a rational standpoint, the idea that you would be better off dead if by being dead you wouldn't be in a state? You can't say that that state is better than the state that you're in if that isn't a state. It's non-existence. So that is the point that he's making. He'll probably continue to elaborate on the same one. But for those of you who didn't understand it, it's as simple as that. So let's get back to it.
They were to make that choice. Call this the two-state requirement. Normally, when we make judgments about whether something would leave you better off or worse off, we satisfy the two-state requirement. You're trying to decide whether or not to lose some weight. And you think, well, here's how well off I am now being overweight. Here's how well off I would be later if I were to lose that weight. I can compare the two states, say the second state's better than the first state. That's what makes it true that I'd be better off. Trying to decide whether or not to marry the person or break up with the person or pick this career or change careers. You've got the state you're in and you compare it to the state you would be in, you compare the two states, that's what allows us to say, yeah, I'd be better off, or no, I'd be worse off. But when we're talking about cases of suicide, cases where, well, here I am now, the before state requirements in place, but if we contrast that with the after state requirement, well, that part's not met, right? When you, on the assumption that death is the end, that you won't exist, non-existence isn't a state that you will be in. It's not a condition of you, because states and conditions presuppose existence. We can talk about, are you happy? Are you sad? Are you bored? Are you excited? All of those things presuppose your existence. Even are you sleeping is a state or condition you can be in because you exist. But if I kill myself, I won't exist. There is no second state to compare. So how could we possibly say, the objection goes, how could we possibly say that I'd be better off dead? That seems to presuppose that there's a second state that we can compare to my actual state. Since there isn't one, the judgment, I'd be better off dead, can't even get off the ground. It's got a logical mistake built right into it. Well, that's the objection. And as I say, there are a number of philosophers who are drawn to it. Maybe some of you are drawn to it as well. It seems to me that it's mistaken. Consider what we wanted to say when we talked about the deprivation account, the central account of what's bad about death. For most of us, dying would be bad because it would deprive us of the good things in life that we would get if only we didn't die. That seemed like a natural thing to say. It seemed like an appropriate thing to say. Of course.
All right. Well, he seems to be about to object to the idea that he just presented, and that interests me. I want to make it very clear that to a certain degree, I share that understanding. One of the reasons somebody shouldn't kill themselves, one of the reasons you shouldn't kill other people, one of the reasons dying is bad is because when somebody dies, they no longer have the ability to experience pleasure. And I find that pleasure and with it, the avoidance of suffering make up the meaning of life. And they're very vague. They're very broad. You can say pleasure pertains to many things: health, well-being, flourishing, wisdom, what have you. But no matter how you're looking at pleasure, you are unable to experience it when you die. If we're going with the assumption that upon the death in this life, you do not go anywhere else. And I do operate with that assumption, I should say. And I know that some people who are interested in philosophy might be saying, you're presupposing naturalism, you're presupposing materialism. It is simply the case that I have an explanation for the cause of consciousness, and that is activity, chemicals, pattern movement of neurons within the brain that make up consciousness. So when that cause ends, so too does its effect. So if we're operating with this assumption, that is what we're to say. So going back to the lecture, I'm having a hard time clicking right now, and I feel stupid.
We might ask, if we believe in the two-state requirement, how could we have said that? After all, given the two-state requirement, to say that death is bad for me, I'd be better off staying alive. If we believe in the two-state requirement, we've got to say, oh, so had I died, I would have been in some state that I could compare to my current state and say that it's worse. But of course, death isn't a state. So the two-state requirement's not met. Well, we might say this should give us some pause. If the two-state requirement, it'd be one thing if all that the two-state requirement said was, we can't ever say you'd be better off dead. But it turns out the two-state requirement's got more implications than that. It's got the implication that you can't even say you're better off staying alive. And that's very, very hard to believe. Imagine that you've got some happy person, some incredibly happy person with a wonderful life filled with whatever goods you think are worth having in life. love and accomplishment and knowledge and whatever it is. He's walking across the street, and he's about to get hit by a truck. And so, at some risk to yourself, you leap into the way, pushing him out of the way, saving his life. And happily, you don't get hurt either. He looks up, realizes he was this close from death, and he says, thank you for saving my life. And now what you have to say is, oh, I'm afraid you're rather confused. Because to say thank you for my saving your life is to presuppose I've benefited you in some way. To presuppose I've benefited you in some way is to assume that it's a good thing that your life has continued. But you see, given the two-state requirement, we can't say it's a good thing that your life continued.
I would argue that if all of the evidence that we have seems to suggest that your ability to experience pleasure depends on you being alive, then you can justify saying that somebody did a good thing by saving your life, because in doing so, they saved your ability to experience pleasure in itself. So everything that you experience, every form of goodness you are ever going to experience, has been saved by that person saving your life. So that's where I would disagree with this, and that's my take.
The requirement says we can only make that kind of remark when there's a before state and an after state, and the after state would have been non-existence. So you see, you're really rather philosophically confused in thinking that I've done you some sort of favor by saving your life. I can't take that argument seriously. It seems to me that, and I hope that none of you would take it seriously either.
I hope no one takes that seriously.
You are doing somebody a favor when you save their life, given the assumption that their life has been and would continue to be wonderful.
It doesn't have to be wonderful.
And what that
just has to involve
is not
pleasure.
That. So non-existence really is a kind of spooky, super thin state or condition. No, of course it isn't. Non-existence is non-existence. It's no kind of condition or state at all. What it shows is the two-state requirement isn't a genuine requirement on these sorts of evaluations.
Well, what would it mean for it to be a genuine requirement? Because I think that the two-state requirement is necessary for making comparisons between states. But then when it comes to the question of suicide, I've already accepted that you couldn't possibly compare not being in any state with the state that you're currently in. So that raises some questions, since I'm willing to grant, as I recently stated, that saving somebody's life if they were about to die would be a good thing, because you would be saving their ability to experience pleasure in itself. But I don't think a comparison is necessary for that. So I will leave that to you guys to think about, to consider. What he just said and my response to it, and that's what we're in it for. I'm no expert in philosophy. I'm well versed in it, but I'm I've never taken a college class. I watch a lot of these lectures, and I'm certainly not a licensed therapist, psychologist. So let's I should have stated that at the beginning of this stream. Actually, I'm actually kind of regretful that I didn't. But let's continue. Let's see where else he has to go. And I don't know that I'll be reviewing this whole thing. I hope we get away from the two-state requirement pretty soon. I do think that we are almost beating a dead horse here, but it is still relevant, so we can hear him continue to talk about this the two-state requirement. Let's go forward with it.
We don't have to say that if you had died, when you point to the person whose life you saved, we don't have to say that had you died, you would have been in some inferior state. We simply have to say the life you would have had I saved you, and indeed will have, given that I have saved you, is a great life. Since it's good, to lose it would be bad. Since losing it would be bad, saving it for you is benefiting you. It's doing you a favor. Two-state requirement says otherwise. two-state requirement's got to go. But having gotten rid of it, we can say the same thing in principle on the other side. Imagine there was somebody whose life was horrible, full of pain and suffering and misery. Now, whether there could be such a person, again, that's a question we'll turn to in a second. But if there were such a person, then we can say, for their life to continue isn't good for them, it's bad for them. Their life is full of misery and suffering and frustration and disappointment. And the more and more of that, the worse and worse the life is. To lead a life of 100 years where every moment is torture and pain is worse than a life of 30 years where every moment is torture and pain. So if you had such a person, for their life to go longer would be bad. In which case, for their life to be going shorter would be better for them. And that's all we mean when we say they'd be better off dead. Not that there's some spooky, super thin and hard to describe condition that they'd be in if they were dead, but simply we look back at the two possible lives they could have. Just with the person whose life we saved, the first person we...
Okay, I will say I do feel like it's beating a dead horse here, because I do think that it has been well established that the two-state requirement may not be entirely necessary, or although I almost just said that it was. It's necessary for making comparisons, but we don't have to make such a comparison in order to view whether or not it would be a good thing to save the life of another person. So that's how we go. So I wanted to address the chat. Now I have some people in the chat. My good friend Eddie from Brute Facts Podcast. What's up, man? You asked if this was Shelley Kagan. Well, you know what? I might be able to check if might be able to pick up on the name in the description. It's from Yale University. Nope, doesn't say the professor's name, so I don't know. I'll have to leave it at that. But there was also a question that was asked, so I wanted to go in. So when someone commits suicide to save other lives, is this morally and rationally correct? How do I throw that up there? Okay, when someone commits suicide to save other lives, is this morally and rationally correct? I would say morally correct is an odd thing to say to me. I understand what it means. Is it morally right to do so? I would consider it to be virtuous. I think I would consider that to be moral. Yes, if you are doing it to save others, that is moral. It's not a moral requirement, though. And this goes again to me not being a deontologist and not believing in objectively existing duties. I don't think somebody could ever be actually required to commit suicide, to save another person's life. But would it be rational? That's a completely separate topic, and I think it's a good thing you asked both of those questions. In a few senses, yes, and in a few senses, no. If you are, wow, that's actually a really good question. Would it be rational for somebody to commit suicide if they knew that doing so would save the lives of other people? Wow, I don't really have an answer. That's actually a way better question than I could think of. Eddie responded, is that really suicide? I would say in most cases, yes, to his question. I know that he wasn't asking me, but I would say in most cases, yes, that would still be suicide. My opinion, my answer. But let's get back into this.
We compare the great life that lasts 100 years versus the great life that only lasts 20 years because you didn't save their life. We say, the life of 100 years, better life. And so saving their life is a good thing for them. Similarly, we compare the lives of misery, the long life versus the short life of misery, and we say, the long life of misery is a worse life to have than the short life of misery. And that being the case, we simply can say you'd be better off dead. Not that you'd be in some condition that's a good one. It's simply you'd avoid this condition, which is a bad one. And if the two-state requirement says otherwise, so much the worse for the two-state requirement.
Okay, right. I think I'm on board with that.
So this is by way of the logical worry that we can't even get off the ground in talking about the possibility that you'd be better off dead. I think If we believed in the two-state requirement, maybe we'd have to say that. But the cost of accepting the two-state requirement is so implausible. You know, the person's dying of a heart attack and you perform CPR. Right? Instead of saying thank you, they say, oh, you know, I'm really no better off than I would have been if I died, even though I'm having a wonderful life. Two-state requirement is just so implausible, we should let it go. Now, having done that, of course, doesn't yet tell us that it could, in fact, be the case that somebody's life could be so bad that they'd be better off dead, that the existence that they've got is worse than not existing at all. All we've done so far is open the door to the possibility of saying that coherently. But that doesn't mean it's true. Whether or not there could be such lives depends on your view about what's the correct account of well-being. What is it that goes into making somebody's life worthwhile?
I'm very reluctant to agree that there is such thing as a correct account of well-being. I'm not going to state a disagreement, but I'm very reluctant to accept that.
Now, as we've seen previously, this is a controversial topic. People disagree about the ingredients of the best kind of life. And because of these differences, you're going to get philosophical differences of opinion with regard to whether or not a life could be so bad that it'd be better for it to come to an end. I'm not going to try to rehearse all the possible theories there are, or for that matter, even all the theories that we've talked about previously. But to give you an illustration of how it could be true, go back to our simplest theory of well-being, hedonism, according to which your quality of life is a matter of adding up all the pleasure and subtracting all the pain. And
I don't know if that has to be hedonism in every circumstance, because I think when people talk about hedonism, they refer more to like bodily pleasure. So when I say that the meaning of life is pleasure, I don't mean pleasure in the sense of, you know, having sex or doing drugs or anything like that. I mean the pleasure in respect to something similar to eudaimonia. You know, you would derive pleasure from health. You derive pleasure from there are multiple different types of pleasures that exist in life. My understanding of hedonism is that it's based primarily on bodily pleasure. So that's a quick distinction that I would make with what he just said. So I don't think that I'm a hedonist, although I could be a hedonist if I'm just wrong about what hedonism is. Though I don't think that that's what it is. I think that it's simply utilitarianism that I'm arguing for by using pleasure in a way that is not limited to the types of pleasure that could be experienced by, you know, by things like pigs. So we're going to go forward on this.
You need to take into account how long the pleasures and the pains last and how intense the pleasures and the pains are. But still, we add up the total amount of pleasure, add up the total amount of pain, subtract the pain from the pleasure, and look to see what our grand total is. If it's positive, your life's worth living, and the greater the number, the greater the positive number, the more your life is worth living. If it's negative, though, if your life is filled with pain and suffering, or at least so much pain and suffering that it outweighs whatever pleasures you may have in your life, so that your balance is a negative one, then your life's not worth living.
And perhaps I'm making the error, the modal scope error, where I'm switching from ontology to epistemology here. But if let me repeat the last point that he made. That I felt that was pretty important.
Pain and suffering, or at least so much pain and suffering that it outweighs whatever pleasures you may have in your life, so that your balance is a negative one, then your life's not worth living.
However, you could probably almost never know that to be the case. So if right now it was true for me that my life would have, from the future on after this stream, if it were the case that my life would involve more suffering than pleasure, and I mean significantly more suffering than pleasure, right? Like if it were the case right after the stream for the rest of my life, that was the case, you could say that it would actually be the best decision for me to commit suicide. However, if that was the case, how could I ever possibly know that to be true? Especially if you're somebody anywhere near my age group, there's still so much time ahead of you that I don't see how you could rationally figure out if you're in one of those circumstances, unless you're in one like I gave the 9/11 scenario, where if you're in, you were in that building and you were above where the plane had crashed into, you were unable to get out of the building. You knew that you would be suffering until the building collapsed. Then it would be rational for you to jump out in that aspect. But yeah,
having that goal.
In other words, in most cases, even if it is the case that your life going forward will contain more suffering than pleasure, I think that there would be very, very, very few circumstances in which you would actually be able to know that or even justifiably believe it. Because remember, those are different. I'm an epistemologist, got to make that difference. But that's where I stand on that.
Longer and longer is just more and more negative balance. That's a life that's bad for you to have, and you'd be better off not having it. You'd be better off having your life come to an end. You'd be better off dead. And of course, the more and more negative the grand total is, the worse your life is. And so the more it's true that you'd be better off dead. Well, that's what hedonism says. If we're not hedonists, and of course, previously I've argued that we shouldn't be hedonists, then we need a more complicated theory of...
I will emphasize that I think he's conflating utilitarianism with hedonism, but that's my own thought, so sorry.
Good. We need to throw in other things, perhaps certain external goods. It's not just a matter of getting the insides right, the pleasure and the pain and the other mental states. There are various facts about your objective hookup with the rest of the world. Are you really climbing Mount Everest? Are you really accomplishing things? Do people really love you? And so forth and so on. Whatever your list is of those other objective goods, well, you'll probably also want to have a list of other objective bads besides pain.
They don't have to be objective to me,
but still,
that's
the
fine.
same basic idea is going to be in place. We're going to want to somehow add up all of the various objective goods, add up all the various objective bads, and see where the balance lies. Do the goods outweigh the bad? If the goods outweigh the bad, that's great. Your life's worth living. But if the bads outweigh the good, then your life is not worth living or not worth continuing.
Yet in most cases,
now,
you wouldn't know
as we've
it.
noted before, there are philosophical theories which go on to claim pessimists, various versions of pessimistic views, which say for everybody in all circumstances, life is so bad that they'd be better off dead. Life's so full of suffering and misery that whatever pleasures there are and other goods there may be in the life, they get outweighed by the objective bads.
But if they're telling you, then they lived to tell you it, and I find that worth considering.
There are philosophical views like that, but I suppose the common sense view is, well, even if some lives may be so bad that the person's better off dead, that's not true of all lives. It depends on the facts of the case.
Relative to the person.
Let's focus on that possibility. Of course, even here, we still have to return to another issue that we've considered before, namely, is life itself worth having? Is the very fact that you're alive itself a good thing? These are the valuable container theories, which I've previously contrasted with the neutral container theories.
So in respect to that question, as somebody who doesn't believe in intrinsic good, I'm forced to say no, but your ability to experience anything that is good would depend on your life. So in a sense, yes.
Recall that according to the neutral container theories, in thinking about the quality of someone's life, you just look at the contents. Life itself is only a container, good or bad, depending on what it's filled up with. But opposed to the neutral container theories, we had valuable container theories, which say the very fact that you're alive adds some positive value above and beyond whatever's going on in your life. Now, even the valuable container theories came in different versions. There were more modest versions where, in principle, the positive value of being alive could be outweighed if the contents got bad enough. And we contrast that with fantastic container theories, according to which being alive is so valuable that it doesn't matter how bad the contents get, the grand total is always a positive one. Now look, if you accept a fantastic container theory, then pretty clearly it's never true that somebody could be better off dead. Because no matter how bad the contents get, the fact that they're alive per se is so valuable, it outweighs that subtotal, giving us a positive grand total. So pretty clearly, from the perspective of fantastic container theories, suicide will never be rational, because it's never true that you're better off dead, because it's never true that your life overall, taking everything that's relevant into consideration, gives us a negative. Yeah, question?
With the fantastic container theory, what's so fantastic about life itself? Like, I say it's intrinsically good about itself.
Question was, on the fantastic container theories, what's so incredible about life itself? Are we saying it's intrinsically valuable? And yes, the answer is precisely. Right? The fans of the valuable container
but
theories
this is
are
where
saying
I disagree.
Being alive itself is valuable. You may recall
Okay,
that
so I don't believe in intrinsic value, so there's some disagreement between me and him here. But as I stated at the beginning of the stream, I noticed a few people joined in since the beginning. I'm what I refer to as an optimistic nihilist, and that is to say that while I don't believe that life has any intrinsic meaning, I don't think that it necessarily follows that life cannot have any meaning. So I'm always very reluctant to say that life doesn't have meaning. Just life doesn't have intrinsic meaning, but that gives us the freedom to assign meaning to things and fulfill that meaning. So, in other words, life is as meaningless as words. For example, words do not have intrinsic meaning, right? We prescribe, and I'm not a prescriptivist, but there's a sense in which I'm using the word prescribe here. We prescribe meaning to sounds that we make with our mouth, and that becomes what those words mean. Those words do not intrinsically mean that, right? But the fact that language doesn't have intrinsic meaning doesn't mean we're going to stop using it. We're going to continue to use language, and money might not be intrinsically valuable, but we assign value to it. So I think there's a pretty big problem in philosophy where people make this distinction from, no intrinsic value or no intrinsic meaning, therefore there's no meaning or value. I'm very happy that life doesn't come with prescribed intrinsic meaning, that I don't just walk into a life that already has meaning assigned to it. In a sense, that makes me a slave to some pre-assigned meaning. That's how I feel. I would much rather, and it doesn't matter what I prefer, but I think I'm happier in what I think is the case, where life doesn't have any objective intrinsic meaning, and that sets me free to assign meaning to the things that I find meaningful, that I wish to assign meaning to, and I can then go fulfill that meaning. It doesn't matter if it's objective or intrinsic. It doesn't matter, if I fall in love with somebody, I don't need the universe to care if I'm in love or not, to know what I'm experiencing. So I guess I just look at value and meaning as being entirely different and not dependent on being intrinsic in any way. So, I'm going to continue from here.
Basically said, although people talk that way.
Oh, I just want to say, Aunt Jared joined the chat. So what's up, Aunt Jared? Why is there only 2 people here? That's because I'm not that popular, at least not yet. But we're getting there, right? So who knows how many people will see this stream after the fact. But yep, 3 people as of now. Hey, there were 0 for the first half of it. So we're getting somewhere. Anyway.
They probably don't actually mean it, right? If you told them, okay, you could be alive as a blade of grass, they wouldn't say, oh, wouldn't that be wonderful? That's worth having. Most fans of the claim that being alive per se is valuable don't really mean life per se. They mean something more like life as a person. Being the kind of entity who can think and plan. Even if your plans go wrong, at least you were a person able to experience things, know things, and so forth. Of course, if that's the reason for accepting the fantastic container theory, then we might wonder, what should we say about those cases where the P functioning has decayed and the person is no longer able to continue as a person, but perhaps can still feel pain? in that case, perhaps life could cease to be worth living. Though, whether or not we should describe it in that way also depends on these complicated issues that we've discussed previously about would that still be you? Would you still exist? Would you still be alive under those circumstances? So the basic idea behind valuable container theories is that life, or the life of a person or something like that, has intrinsic value above and beyond the question of what's going on within your life.
Okay, so I stated my disagreement, and that was just with the value being intrinsic. I think value is something that we assign. I would assign value to life, one of the main reasons being that you must necessarily, at least according to my worldview, be alive in order to experience pleasure. And if pleasure is the meaning of life, then that's going to be pretty important. But anyway, I did give my friend Eddie Kroom from the Brute Facts podcast some in the chat, sent him a message on Facebook and decided, let's get this guy in and see what he has to add to the discussion. So joining me now, and let me take the video off the stream. Hey, what's up, Eddie?
What it is, Shane?
Oh, same old. I decided to, as you've been in the chat, been seeing, I'm, just making a video, a stream. It's just about the philosophical inquiry of the morality. I began with the morality and then moved to the rationality of suicide. Very important distinction that a lot of non-philosophers might fail to get to. I was coming from a perspective of, he started talking about the meaning of life. And this is one thing that's a little bit scary to me, is when I hear a professor like this, who's very wise, seem to say that life's meaning was dependent on it being intrinsic. At least it was implied. And I think meaning and value could exist without them being intrinsic. So what are your thoughts on some of that part of the discussion?
Oh, man. I would tend to agree with him. For the fact I love Shelley Kagan. He's
genetic fallacy. Sorry.
He's actually an atheist too.
Right. Yeah.
Okay.
But so you're looking at life from this perspective of, even if it has meaning and it has value, that if that value and that meaning are not intrinsic, and for those of you who don't know, intrinsic would be naturally occurring, naturally existing, and objectively true, you think that therefore life would not be worth living in that circumstance, if that were the case.
If life wasn't intrinsically valuable?
Right.
I wouldn't necessarily agree with that for the simple fact that there's something to life, whether we assign value or not, that keeps us to want to live.
But we want to live because we're assigning value to it. So like I listed earlier, for example, love. I don't think that love has to be intrinsically valuable in order for us to value it the way that we do. And for that, the fulfillment of that value to be a pretty good reason against suicide, actually.
Well, okay. I think we're kind of talking past each other. When I talk about intrinsic value, I'm talking about the inherent value of human beings. I'm not talking about specific characteristics that we value.
Right.
My point was, if there's not intrinsic value to human beings, a human being can view others as not being valuable, and even their self being valuable, and still want to live because they can find pleasures, like he was talking about, types of hedonistic pleasures, things that seem to be more fun than not living. But I think ultimately, regardless of if there's a God or not, I still think that human beings have intrinsic value. If I
right. I mean, I could agree that intrinsic value existing could be independent of whether or not a God exists. So I think we agree on that point.
Yeah, I would take the position a couple of my atheist agnostic friends would take, that we assign value to sentience and moral agency, things that have the capacity to be moral, have a duty to be moral to things that can experience suffering. I think it would be, you could argue that pretty much all life is intrinsically valuable, but when we get to humans, I think, starting on the fence of speciesism, I would say that there's something special given the level of awareness that we have. Most animals, according to a lot of experts, don't have that higher level of awareness of pain and suffering. So we're more conscious of the fact that we're in pain and we're suffering, when other animals, of course, higher primates would probably fit in there too. I think you could get a pretty robust view.
But right. So if life is intrinsically valuable, is the value that human beings have beyond that intrinsic value prescribed from human beings? So in other words, do you think that in respect to intrinsic value, you, me, an elephant, a monkey, a squirrel, all have equal intrinsic value, but then that human beings have further value attached? Or do you think that even the intrinsic value, with respect to people, that we have more of it?
I would say that to word it that way, I would say we probably have more value, but I would view it more as we have more moral lots and duties.
Yeah.
We have, the ability to create laws to prevent other thinking things like us from acting certain ways. Laws don't matter to primates, so it's obvious that there's some type of awareness separation there. They can't create their own. They can do math, but they can't create their own math. They can't discover math. And
I see that. I think all of that is valuable in that we are able to value it, but I don't see why being civilized, for example, is intrinsically valuable. And I guess, and you're right, to some degree, it gets to a point where we're talking past each other because we're both agreeing with value in life, but we're disagreeing with the nature of that value. And I guess to a certain degree, it's good to, in some circumstances, you got to focus, especially as philosophers, more on the disagreement and where the disagreement begins. And that's what I've been doing so far. But it looks like, focusing on the agreement for the sake of this discussion, we're in agreement that, for one, a God not existing would not entail intrinsic value not existing, so that intrinsic value could exist within a theistic or an atheistic worldview. So I'm glad that existed, or that was something we could agree on. And then the disagreement was pertaining to whether value or meaning needed to be intrinsic for it to really be meaningful, if that makes sense. I think, does that sound like a good summary of where we agree and where we disagree?
Yeah, I'd say it's pretty close enough. Now, there is a little nuance to intrinsic value in the absence of a God, because if you take subjective, fallible beings, and we try to come up with this kind of universal, objective thing that we call value, it seems at some point it's going to break down into arbitrariness or something like that without having that ultimate ground. But I don't think that's as big a problem as some theists would make it out to be, because...
And I share that concern. I think both of us have this idea of neither of us want to live in a world of moral relativism. And to be clear, I'm talking not about cultural relativism, but rather individual relativism. And that is actually one of the things when I talk about morality. I understand on the surface, my moral view seems to be almost exactly that. But I want to say, no, I don't think that we all just get to, because while I think that morality and values are subjective, I don't think that they are therefore arbitrary. So I don't think that a person can decide that it is okay. I don't think a person can decide that a specific act like stealing from somebody or killing somebody, I don't think they can decide to make it moral. I think the variables that make it immoral, be them objective or subjective, are still, universal, so that they don't have to be objective to be universal. So that we've covered in our discussion pertaining to morality. But I share that concern.
There's one thing I'd like to add to it. Kind of add this nuance to it. When I say arbitrary, I don't mean in a way that we can't have a working understanding. I mean, like, kind of at a meta level. At some point, when we go to find a type of universal grounding or something like that, it's eventually going to be arbitrary, because we're going to have a bunch of philosophers on the same side who aren't going to agree on it, and they're going to say, no, this should be the grounding, no, this should be the grounding. So the advantage to theism in things like this is we can have a measurement, and we can say everything, it just gives that solid foundation.
Right. I would agree with theism having that advantage over my worldview. But I think that that's more pertaining to an unfortunate thing that follows from my worldview, rather than, that can't be the case. That just goes, well, if A is the case, then this unfortunate B is also the case. As to where, the theist could say, well, from our worldview, we can ground it in this way, and it is easier, and it does work out more effectively. But I would agree that theism has that advantage in that it's much easier to ground everything in it.
Yeah, and I just want to make it clear, for any other atheists that are listening, when I, talk about the advantage of this, we're talking way above a working level. And what I mean is, we have a level of practicality, pragmatism, where we can agree on this level that, hey, certain types of creatures, have this kind of value that we have to protect, regardless of what it's grounded in, even if it's just intuition. Intuition
Right.
and philosophy's pretty strong. It's not just a feeling, it's something you can actually be warranted in the absence of defeaters. So
Yeah.
if we all had this intuition that we should not kill other humans, even if we can't ground that, we still pretty much all understand that.
Yeah, I would agree with you. Absent of defeaters, we should go with our intuitions.
Yeah, and I think for the most part, those who haven't been distorted or have some type of mental problems, we would all agree that in most tragic situations, that things like that are tragic. So I think we have a kind of a level playing field we can start with. We don't have to go to the meta level of it and say, well, let's go and dive way deeper into it and see where it pans out. We'll leave that for the actual philosophers.
Right.
But we can start with, hey, we're valuable by nature of what we are. And I'm actually kind of interested in your idea of assigning value.
Yeah. So I assign value to pleasure, and not only my own ability to experience it, but for that to be experienced by others as well. So one of the reasons, if I save your life, one of the things for me that makes that a good thing is the fact that I don't think, because I don't believe in an afterlife, I don't think that you would be able to further experience any pleasure beyond dying. So in saving your life, I am fundamentally saving your ability to experience good of any kind. And if I am letting you continue to have the ability to experience good of any kind, then that's a good thing. So I think that we are unable to not assign value. I mean, you have people who have conditions like sociopathy or psychopathy or whatever, but we are unable to make the decision to stop assigning value to things. I don't think that you could choose to stop loving somebody. And, my position on that may very well change within my lifetime. I understand that, I could maybe in 7 years, I'm like, whoa, that's crazy that I thought that. But I genuinely think that if you love somebody, you can't decide that you love them or decide not to love them. There are things that are going to be the case that are things that you assign value to without choosing it. So maybe you value their kindness. Maybe you value the way that they help others, the way that they are. There are going to be things that you value. And I think that that value, like you assign it, but I don't think that that value exists naturally occurring within the universe.
Can I play philosopher and ask hard questions?
Go for it. I've gone through most of the contemporary suicide, morality, rationality. So let's do this.
These aren't necessarily, questions that I typically ask. I just want to make some hard ones for you. Because I understand on a conceptual level where you're coming from. But what if I was to ask you, why is pleasure good?
Sure. So I think that if you were to ask me why is pleasure good, the best answer that I could give is that we experience it that way. So the same way, if I was on fire and you asked me like, well, why is fire bad? Why is you being in pain bad? Whether or not I can give you some eloquent philosophical justification for fire being bad, it is intrinsic, or I'm sorry, not intrinsically. It is intuitively. It's funny that I said intrinsic. It is intuitive.
It's intrinsically bad.
You're like, gotcha. If you were a precept, that would have been the gotcha of the night.
I'm not. Yeah, but that's just it. I just want to flesh it out. I don't
right.
care about gotcha.
It is intuitively the case if I'm on fire that I should put this fire out. That I should do what I can to survive. My apartment's on fire. I assign value to the avoidance of pain. And if you want to ask me why is avoiding pain good, because if I base for me, the meaning of life is the experience of pleasure and with it, the avoidance of pain. Then when you try to ask me why is that good, I would just have to say that we experience it as good. And that is, maybe a hard pill to swallow for many people who are on my side of this worldview. But I think that, could I justify pain being bad? Maybe not. But is that going to change whether you experience it as bad? No, your inability to come up with an eloquent justification for pain being bad doesn't stop pain from being bad. And the same way, your inability to come up with some eloquent explanation for love being good, or pleasure being good, it doesn't change the fact that you still experience it that way.
This is where Nietzsche gets very, very what's the word I'm looking for? Attractive, because if you just adopt moral nihilism, just say ultimately it doesn't matter. It's not that simple, but I mean it's in the grant we use things in the world in a pragmatic matter, and when we start talking about the ultimate meaning of things like that, but on the grand scheme doesn't matter.
Yeah, but I could also just very easily say that pleasure is the ultimate meaning. And then, it's almost like the same thing as if I were to ask you, like, well, why is God good? You would probably go, well, that is where good comes from, and if I were to go, but why is what God commands good? You would be going, well, you're just asking, like, why does 2 + 2 = 4? It just is, at that point. So.
Well, I wouldn't quite take that route. That would be the, a constituent ontology of God, but that's a discussion for a different day. So here's my concern. And I'm glad we're having this discussion, because I've asked this question before and didn't get a fair answer. But you're far smarter. I can't talk. I was headed to bed before you invited me. I saw your stream. I was like, wow, Shane's on. Oh, crap. He's talking about suicide. Let me see what he's doing.
I prefaced the stream by saying, this might be concerning for people. Everybody, I hope they don't worry. And there was one person who tuned in for like 30 seconds and they heard me say, like, I'm not contemplating suicide. And they tuned right back out. I'm like, okay, I'm glad I was able to ease their concern.
Well, hey, let me tell you something. Just philosophy aside for a moment. I was diagnosed with major depressive disorder when I was a lot younger. Anxiety disorder, ADHD.
Those are a horrible combination.
And OCD.
Yeah, that's got to be rough.
So my joke about it to lighten up is, I can never get things in order, and I get pissed off because I can't get them in order because the ADHD, then the OCD, and then I get depressed when that doesn't work out, and then I just sit here with the anxiety because I'm depressed. So it's like a vicious cycle. But it's at a workable point. My quality of life is pretty decent, but I still have moments out of nowhere, seemingly sometimes. We don't pay attention to a lot of the stress we have building up, and it kind of culminates. So with that said, this is a topic that is very, very close to me. There's been many times in my life when I was younger, if I didn't have children or people that love me, there's no telling what I'd have done. It was something I couldn't do to them. So I just want to say, anybody that's watching or may watch this, don't toy around with depression. Sometimes you may bounce out of it, and sometimes you'll go deeper.
Yeah.
And if somebody hasn't experienced clinical depression, it's horrible.
Yeah, I too have clinical depression, and I'm at least fortunate enough to not always be in a deep, dark state of depression. So I could go months without experiencing some like severe darkness, but then, some life-changing circumstances happen, and all of a sudden I'm right back where I used to be. But I did attempt suicide once when I was 19 years old. And, the only reason I'm here today is because I failed. And, of course, I'm glad that I failed. But it's always something that I'm going to have to consider, and I'm able to consider the fact that I'm glad that I didn't, that I wasn't successful in my attempt. And I try to, have other people who are suicidal consider, like, there will be moments in life in which you go, wow, it's a good thing I didn't kill myself that one day, because I wouldn't be here right now. And those moments actually come quite often. Life does have plenty of those moments to offer us. So,
unfortunately, given the nature of our disorder, when things get extremely hectic or stressful, it's almost like a natural response to, kind of crawl in and fall back and.
Right. Like, even if you're not thinking about it deeply, sometimes it just immediately comes to mind, Yeah,
it's it's something, it's almost like a defense mechanism in a way, but it works the opposite. It doesn't help. And I often wondered at times, how does somebody get so lonely or so done with the world that that's their best option? And after going through a severe depression, I totally understand. I went through about 2 weeks, almost 3 weeks of some of the most horrible time in my life. I was angry when I woke up because I didn't want to wake up. I lost my job. Everything I loved was sapped from me. I had no drive. I couldn't think of any. It was like a black cloud, a literal black cloud over me, and all I wanted to do was sleep all day. That was it.
That's a big one when I get suicidal. Sleeping all day. I've heard this joke that is somewhat of a joke, but also have some truth to it, that sleep is like death with benefits.
Yes.
You're like, okay, I'm gonna quick break from existing.
And I actually sometimes, just high stress times, find myself with little things like that, not wanting to get up, like, whatever. I want to sleep. I just want to lay here. I don't care doing life today. Right. I just,
I've had to force myself to the best of my ability, because sometimes you're not going to have the ability. I've had to force myself to the best of my ability out of getting back into that state in the past month or two, because I'm going through my first breakup. I've only been in one relationship in my life. And when you've only been in one relationship, and that takes place between the age of 22 and 23, and that's a relationship that's about a year long, in which you lived with somebody, I'm used to living with somebody else. Now I live alone again. just a major adjustment to life. I'm autistic. Adjustments, like big changes like that, are difficult. So I'm having to take all of the steps that I can think of and come up with and do to, get out there. I'm going to restaurants again. Since I'm vaccinated, I could do that. Seeing friends, really most of it is I'm going hard on the philosophy more than ever lately. Going through Nietzsche books left and right. Although maybe Nietzsche isn't the best author to go
probably
through.
not the best one to be going through right now.
I thought about it. I was like, you know what? Maybe this isn't the best time to get into Nietzsche, but I'm already kind of stuck in there. So,
well, he gets a bad rap, but Nietzsche was a phenomenal philosopher.
Absolutely. And I will say that there are often times when I read him and I'm like, wow, this is kind of dumb. Like there's
all your continental philosophers are going to be, you're going to be like, huh, what, huh?
But then you read a few pages and you're like, this is the smartest thing I've ever read.
That's when some stuff starts to click, it's like, wow, whoa. It's like, I don't know if you're an NF fan, but his new song, one of his new songs is Layers. And he's like, there's layers to layers and layers. And it makes me think, and when I think about, continental philosophers, you just kind of peel back the layers, it's sometimes it makes sense. Sometimes it doesn't. The old cliche is, if you want to be known as a good philosopher, write as ambiguously and abstractly as possible, so you have a whole bunch of different people trying to interpret you.
I guess that makes sense.
Because if you think about it, the most philosophers that get the most attention are not the ones that were easy to understand. It's the ones that you've got 10 academic books from different PhD philosophers. Right. No, this is what he meant.
And that's one of the things that got me into Nietzsche. Is there's a professor that I watch a lot of his videos on YouTube. His name's Dr. Jason J. Campbell, and he does an entire series that is over 100 videos long, in which the videos are about 10 minutes or more each, addressing Will to Power by Nietzsche. And that's not even one of I just recently got 6 books by Nietzsche, and then I saw this review, and I was like, well, now I got to listen to this book on audiobook, So I start listening to it to follow that lecture series, and, I get into it. And even though, as we've stated, maybe Nietzsche isn't the best philosopher to get into if you're trying to distract yourself from pessimism. Yeah. So, that might not be the best idea out of my end. I will say that wisdom is one of the things that I value enough to assign it as one of the things that gives my life meaning. I am a philosopher in the sense of what the word originally meant. Philosophy meant the love of wisdom. I am a lover of wisdom, and so
that's me. I'll tell you, in the short time that I've known you, seeing some of the older videos you did, and now the progress has been phenomenal. So
thank you.
You're getting there. I mean, it's I've had conversations with you that I haven't had a whole lot with outside of the philosophy group that I'm in, because people just usually don't spend that much time in it. We're like odd people, we like to think. We like to think about thinking, and then we think some more about thinking.
And then you think about the contents of your thinking in respect to your thinking. And then, you're, it's a lot of people consider philosophers to be moronic or neurotic. They're like, these people are crazy. They're sitting there trying to figure out how they exist, and that's a reasonable perspective to non-philosophers,
it is, until you kind of illuminate a couple of things to them.
Yeah, I agree.
You wouldn't have math without philosophers.
You wouldn't have math. You wouldn't have science, because people love giving the argument where they go, well, science cures disease. What does philosophy do? And I'm like, give you science so that you could cure disease.
Yeah, because
that's what it does.
You have to interpret the evidence, and that is philosophy. You can take 2 scientists who have 2 different philosophical schools, train of thought, in the philosophy of science, and they may disagree on it. Now, it doesn't mean they can't repeat certain things, and they'll argue over what it means. But real quick, to the philosophers and the hard ones to follow, I was going to give a couple examples. Now,
Okay.
this doesn't mean that the philosophers aren't respected and genius in their own right, but it's not the ones that get most of the playtime, because they were too clear. Bertrand Russell, David Hume. You look at these different philosophers that we can pretty much understand a lot what they say, and everybody else is like, oh yeah, David Hume. Oh, Bertrand
Yeah.
Russell. Oh yeah, stuff.
Yeah.
It's like, oh, okay, he's not complicated enough for you. That's what it is. He's too
Right.
straightforward. Not that they not complicated in their own rights, but there were a lot of things they were really clear with.
Yeah.
So
anyway, we got there through talking about assigning. I assign a lot of value to wisdom, and I talked about that being part of why I've been deep diving even more into philosophy lately. But of course, I value some more basic things. And before I get to basic things, I'll say that love is one of the things that I value the greatest. And when I say love, the same way pleasure pertains to more than just bodily pleasure, love pertains to more than just intimate love. There are all kinds of people that we have all kinds of different love for. I love you in a sense that is different in the sense in which I love my mom, and I love my mom in a sense that's different from the way that I love my now we're broken up, so my ex, but I still love her. So there's love to be had, and that experience of having love is one of the things that is of highest of value to me.
right.
I was getting into those earlier. So one of the things that I said at the beginning of this stream was that and I'll actually look in how I put it in my notes, because there's no reason I can't just revisit it. This is a little bit less of a scripted, organized stream than I normally put on, but that's fine. I'm under 1,000 subscribers. I don't have to be professional until I get another 300. So if you guys want to see me get more professional and you haven't subscribed, that's
I will
cue.
say that you killed my planned series I was going to do.
Oh, really?
Yeah, I was going to do one on epistemology, and you released a second video, and I'd forgot you'd already done the first one. And I was like,
Yeah.
damn, I can't do that. Shane's doing that. I'm not going to go bust out with an epistemology series at the same time.
It might actually be good to compare. Maybe not at the same time, but maybe if sometime.
Yeah, I'm going to wait. Yeah,
when I'm done with mine, we can compare and contrast. You can kind of use mine as a scaffolding of yours, if you will.
Well, about half of mine's already written, so.
Oh, well, that's great. Okay, so I couldn't find the part that I meant to.
It actually kind of worked out, because I'm fixing to do a series. I don't know how you feel about eschatology, and all these end time nuts that we have around here.
Yeah, I'm largely unfamiliar with that term, but eschatology pertains to end time nuts, as you stated. People who think that the world's going to end soon, Jesus is going to come back soon. That crowd.
Yeah, and just for a little reference, it's even used like in cosmology too, for the eschaton, or the eschatology of the ending of the universe. Of course, with the rapid expansion that we have.
Yeah.
And entropy. Eventually, the universe will lead to a heat death.
Right.
So anyway, they kind of talk about eschatology within cosmology too.
Okay.
Yeah,
well, that makes sense.
Yeah, but yeah, there's this fundamentalist, dispensationalist eschatology that has gotten roots out of the Left Behind series done by Tim LaHaye. And it is, it's literally stuff you make movies out of. It's ridiculous. And I've had about as much as I can take hearing people talk about we're in the end times. Jesus is coming soon. The war is going to be, the wars are fixing to go crazy. We're going to get the mark of the beast and all these things.
I'm glad you brought up eschatology on a stream that was pertaining to suicide, because I do think that people who think that the world is going to end soon are given another reason why they think it might be the case that they should go kill themselves. That's actually kind of similar to the example I gave in the 9/11 scenario, as I call it, where, in respect to, is there such thing as an example where a person could be in a position in which they would be better off dead than alive? And I always jump to like the first example I could think of is you have, I think September 11th, you have a plane crashing into the building. You have the people above where the plane crashed into that building, and they're stuck in the building with no way of getting out. A lot of people started jumping. I actually believe that the people who jumped were making the most rational decision, because if you were in that building above where the plane crashed and you had no way of getting out, the rest of your life would entail nothing but suffering, having a hard time being able to breathe. You're in the smoke, there's fire, you're in fear. And I think that, so here we have an example where it's like, okay, would you rather continue living for an hour, 2 hours, what have you, or just die now? And I think in that situation, the rational decision would be to die then. But that most people who were in a situation where they'd be better off dead than alive wouldn't be able of knowing it. Does that make sense?
Yeah, and that's knowing what I know now. I would be running into the thick black smoke, sucking it in as fast as I could, because I mean, seriously, it literally takes less than a minute of breathing heavy smoke to pass out. And once you go, once you go unconscious, then you're not even going to know you're dying or burning alive,
which is better than falling.
Yeah. You also got to understand that when you're not trained to respond to fight or flight, you haven't had any kind of training at all, whether it be fight training, police, military, any of that. That's mainly what they train for, is to not allow their internal instincts to take over. Because once fight or flight kicks in, you have no control. Your brain is in 100% self-preservation mode.
Yeah, been there.
And people do stupid things. I lived across the street from...
I'm sorry, go ahead.
No, I was going to say, I lived across the street from firefighters in a pretty good sized city. And the stories that I heard, well, they're not like tales that they told. It was things that like really hurt them. And he said, you would be stunned at how many houses we get to, and right behind an unlocked door, somebody's dead. And you can see where they were kicking on the door because their brain wasn't working. All they had to do is grab and turn the doorknob.
Yeah, I had something similar to that when I got locked in a freezer where I work. The handle on the door, it was one of those walk-in freezers. I'm in a thin t-shirt and it broke. So I remember, banging on the door, kicking it, thinking like, okay, am I going to use the last of my energy trying to get this door open, or should I conserve my energy in the hopes that I could still be alive when somebody opens it? And it never occurred to me to take out my cell phone. Wasn't a thought in my head. Get your cell phone, So that is that is correct in the response in respect to the fight or flight thing. But another thing I wanted to bring forward, because this is more talked about in the beginning of the stream before you got on, but I wanted to read some of my own words regarding the intrinsic meaning and its relation to suicide and what your thoughts on it are. So this is straight from me. So if anyone's wondering why it sounds so dumb in a philosophical discussion, here's why. So here is what I think. If there is no meaning to life, I cannot make sense of the idea that there is meaning to suicide. Intrinsic meaning to suicide presupposes intrinsic meaning to life, which I simply don't believe in. I find that the meaninglessness of life provides us with the opportunity to assign meaning to what we wish, and I find that to be an incredibly beautiful thing. Maybe I shouldn't have said what we wish, but that's, I'll leave that there for now. And then I said examples of things I consider to be worth assigning meaning to are friendships, love, and love would encompass friendships, but friendships, love, productivity, wisdom, and travel. And, I get meaning in my life from productivity as well. And so, for example, I told you I work at a grocery store as a night stalker. So one of the things, and it's only a single thing, it's not the determining factor. One of the things that gives me meaning in my life is knowing that there are other people who are able to get food off of a shelf at a grocery store because of my productivity, because of the fact that I'm going to work and I'm contributing to society. And there is a lot of meaning to that. So a lot of these everyday jobs that people have, are very meaningful if they could think to assign the kind of meaning that I'm assigning to going to work, you know. And that doesn't mean that the meaning of my life is to be a grocery stocker, and that therefore if I get a new job, that now I don't have a meaningful life. Now I assign meaning to something new. What do you think about the philosophy I've sort of just put forward?
I thought it was kind of beautiful. It was, I mean, really, it was with your self-deprecation before saying it, I was expecting something stupid, and it was kind of deep.
Well, thank you.
Man, it actually was.
That's
making
how
me think a
any
little bit.
philosophy. Yeah, you know it's good philosophy if you go, what do I think about it? And you
Yeah,
can't answer
it's-
right away, you know. And that's good. That, you know, I feel better about the fact that you don't have an answer than I would if you did have one right off the bat. So,
yeah, just off the top of my head, reanalyzing it. Yeah, I had to correct him. I'm also the third, fourth, and fifth coming.
yeah,
Oh, there you go.
great.
So if there is intrinsic value in suicide, you're presupposing an intrinsic value
To
on the
life.
life.
Right, because how could suicide be intrinsically meaningful if life isn't? You know, you for you to say that there's meaning to committing suicide, you would have to be assigning some sort of meaning to life in itself. Otherwise, why would the ending of it be meaningful?
Yeah, no, that's pretty deep. It's 3:30 in the morning. That's deep. That's
When you come up with your good philosophy, right? About sometime in
no,
the AM.
that's I mean that
Uh,
no, that really is good. I like that. I mean,
awesome.
yeah, because in order to lose something that you consider a loss in the way that we consider losses a loss, you would have to attribute some value to it.
Right. And so that's one of the places where I come, where if you want to say, if you are talking about a conversation of suicide and you're trying to justify suicide through this belief that life doesn't have meaning, you would have to say that suicide doesn't have meaning either. So you can't justify that either. So, yeah, that's where I feel on that.
Okay. So I have a question that kind of pops in my head. If suicide only hurts the person doing it, and that's what they really, really want, is it truly wrong?
I don't think it can be truly wrong. No. And if it only hurts them, I think it's morally permissible. And I elaborated earlier on one of the problems people might make is it could be the case that it is morally permissible for one to commit suicide. That doesn't mean that therefore one should. And I think that's an assumption people tend to make. But, you know, I think it's morally permissible for me to go count every blade of grass at the dog park behind me. It's morally permissible. That doesn't entail that I therefore should go do it. You can come up with other reasons to say that I shouldn't go count every blade of grass at the dog park, even though you're saying it's morally permissible. You could still grant that there may be some other reasons why I shouldn't do it that don't pertain to morality.
So pushing it a little further, I'm sympathetic to that because one of the areas that I've done a lot of focus, especially early on in philosophy, was bioethics. And so the glaring issue with me is I'm sympathetic to euthanasia.
Yeah.
However, I have a fundamental issue with it, a theological issue too.
Right.
And the fundamental issue that I have is where do we draw the line between someone being mentally ill and taking their life,
right,
and somebody being of sane mind and taking their life?
I think that that's a very important question that inevitably should come up in discussions about euthanasia. But whether or not there is a justification for euthanasia is separate from how we would know which case was one and which one wasn't. I feel that I think that, and if in case anyone doesn't know, euthanasia, we're talking about medically assisted suicide. I think it should be allowed, but I think there should be an application process. Now, inevitably, people are going to argue left and right over this application process and what would qualify somebody. And those arguments would bring about some, I think in a lot of cases, fruitful answers. And we would find where our agreement within the disagreement began, and we would work from there. But I agree that when it comes to, I'm somebody who would say I think we should allow for medically assisted suicide. I don't think I would be the person who would be adequate for determining whether or not someone should be qualified to have, for a medically assisted suicide. With that in mind, I also, in respect to suicide, in some aspects, take a little bit of a libertarian view, where I'm looking at life as one's own property. And while I don't want people to end their lives the same way I don't want you to destroy your property, I have a very difficult time, calling it morally impermissible or immoral of you. Like if you were to just break your headphones right now, I cannot think of a reason why I would call that immoral, but I still really don't want you to do that.
Because I paid a lot of money for them. That's immoral.
That's immoral. Yeah.
Took food off the table for it.
Yeah, but if it's your own money that you spent on it, then I think you have every right to break your own property. But that doesn't mean that I want you to. I might still value the thing that you're breaking, and I might, for a few reasons, having to take issue with it myself emotionally and maybe philosophically as well. So even if I feel like somebody has the right to take their own life, that doesn't mean that I want them to, or that I necessarily think that they should. I might say, okay, you have that right, but that doesn't mean that you should go do it. There are all kinds of things that you have the right to do that it doesn't mean you should go do it. So one of the things I felt there.
Go ahead.
I'm sorry. I was like that. I was wrapping it up. I was saying that was one of my ideas.
Oh, okay.
There.
Yeah.
So yeah.
Yeah. So the next step in it would be, when or do we ever have a moral ought to physically prevent suicide?
Yeah, and that is a question that I made a distinction of in the beginning of this conversation, because you're right, that's a separate question. So the principal moral issue surrounding suicide is this question: are there conditions under which suicide is morally justified? And if so, which conditions? And that question needs to be distinguished from these three questions. Should other individuals attempt to prevent suicide? Should the state criminalize suicide or attempt to prevent it? Is suicide ever rational or prudent? Now, those are separate questions. I think we should try to prevent suicide because I think that it is the case for a lot of people. And I think I would actually serve as a pretty good example of one of these people, where there are people, especially young, I was 19 when I was going through it really bad. There are a lot of people who might think they should kill themselves. And if it be the case that most of the pleasure in life is ahead of them and they would be missing out on that by losing their life, I think that based on my utilitarian ethical framework of doing that which maximizes net pleasure, we would be maximizing net pleasure by maximizing people's ability to experience pleasure in the first place. So I think from my utilitarian ethics, and I know you and I don't agree on utilitarianism, but from my ethics, I think you could justify saying that there is this ought to prevent people from killing themselves, and you might actually help talk somebody out of it, and later that person might help talk you out of it. And I do think that since we're trying to save each other's ability to experience good, we are doing a good thing for each other. And I think that if I were to do the opposite and try to talk you into killing yourself, that would necessarily be immoral for me to do.
So I'm not, necessarily disagreeing with any of the positions.
You get there differently, though.
Well, I'm trying to kind of flesh it all out because it's a very sensitive topic. It's a very important topic, and I'm trying to come at it non-theologically, and
Right.
so on that basis, I think that we have a moral obligation, like you said, to try and prevent suicide.
Yeah. Like if I'm walking by some 18-year-old and he's about to try to kill himself, while it's remotely possible that he is better off dead than alive, I think it is overwhelmingly likely that that is not the case for him. I would try to prevent him from killing himself, and that's one of the disagreements I have with imposition of will being the foundation of immorality.
I was just fixing to say that I would actually take a page out of T-Jump here and think that you're stopping him from committing suicide is immoral, but preventing him from taking his life is the more moral thing to do in the situation. So while it may not be totally you can't totally escape immorality in it, I think that the most moral thing would be to preserve his life.
Yeah. And one of my disagreements with that comes to, I look at immorality as being grounded in the unnecessary causing of suffering of people.
Well, that's what I was saying. But
so
T-Jump has a pretty good on that aspect of it. T-Jumps is actually, because you can still say if they truly wanted to kill themselves and you stop them, in a way that is, it being a libertarian and me being pretty much a libertarian too, and you saying that they have the right to do that, then you're violating, the inherent right that they have to do that. But I would also argue the most moral thing in that situation, because you don't know if they're mentally ill. You don't know if they're sane. You don't. It's a judgment call.
To make it a little bit easier, that is one of the reasons I made the hypothetical scenario an 18-year-old, because most of the cases in which we would think of an 18-year-old being suicidal, it probably isn't the case that they would be better off dead than alive.
Right.
But if you start talking about a 50-plus-year-old with a terminal illness, then things get muddied,
Yeah.
So
definitely.
That's where I definitely lean way more toward the libertarian aspect, and I would go, okay, well, that's his life, that's his property. But then also, I might try to stop somebody. I might not necessarily stop them against their will. So, and it depends on, I don't know exactly what I would do in this scenario. Whatever happens, happens. But if I walk and I see somebody about to kill themselves, I would at least try to talk them out of it, and trying to talk them out of it wouldn't be imposing on their will. So even on these differentiating views on morality, I think that you would still be able to justify trying to stop someone, trying to talk them out of it. And maybe you could throw in, as long as you do so without imposing on their will. And there will be disagreement in there. So that could be, kind of in parentheses. But
kind of colloquially, an honest effort. Just giving it an honest effort. So to add to the complication of it, the courts have ruled that states have interest in individuals, so they can actually protect lives and prevent you from killing yourself. And one of the reasons I know this intimately is my younger brother. You've heard me talk about schizophrenic. When he gets off his medicine and he walks away and goes and acts all psychotic because he has psychosis, he'll have delusional episodes. They'll take him to the mental hospital and they'll do a 72-hour evaluation, and there's two criteria that they look for. Are they an immediate danger to themselves or other people?
Right.
And if they're an immediate danger to themselves, they won't release them. And if you say you and your significant other or family member or something you're real down and out, and you are, leading them on to think that you're going to kill yourself, they can actually come and take you to a hospital,
Right.
to prevent that from happening. So there is,
And I do think what you're raising are important points. These are points that would take entire discussions in themselves to flesh
well,
out.
that's what I'm saying. It adds
Yeah,
another area of
it does.
complication to it, because
Right.
now we're talking on the moral perspective. Now we're talking about the legal perspective.
Yeah. But then
they
again, there's
do cross
also,
paths.
yeah,
You know,
because there's
they're
also
kind
the
of intertwined.
differentiation, as I stated before, between the first question, which was, are there conditions under which suicide is morally justified? So for a person to commit suicide, but then there's the other questions, which should other individuals attempt to prevent suicide? Should the state criminalize suicide or attempt to prevent it? Then is suicide ever rational or prudent? So there are a lot of different questions to be asked in respect to the discussion about suicide. And I think that it's something that needs to be talked about, because we can't let the only discussions about about suicide be conversations in which people are trying to talk you out of it. But of course, I don't want to talk anybody into it either. Right.
Yeah,
So I did preface this stream by letting people know, if you're in a really deep, dark place, that this probably might not be a good stream for right now. But I did also say that I hope that they would come back at another time, because I do think that a lot of what this stream has covered would be beneficial to somebody going through the process of battling suicidal thoughts. With that said, I want to sort of begin to wrap this stream up. I will be putting a link to the, for those of you who don't know, if anybody doesn't know, I recently joined the Atheist Network group. So I'll be putting a link to the Discord for an after show talk. If anybody wants to join in, I don't expect there to be a lot of people, but that'll be in the live chat. You guys can find the link to the Discord. But before I close out, Eddie, I wanted to see, what are some final thoughts you had on the discussion pertaining to the morality and rationality of suicide?
Oh man, it is a very serious topic that needs to be talked about.
Yeah.
And this is one thing that philosophers don't get enough credit for, is these are the hard things that, you know, philosophers have to tackle.
Yeah.
You know, the ethical nature of things and coming up with reasons why it's ethical or not ethical.
Right.
And have good, sound, robust defenses for it.
Yeah.
I think that, given the initial premise of it, I think that suicide in the protection of other lives is more akin to valor and not suicide, like we tend to, because, you know, that's like a soldier who jumps on a grenade to save his platoon.
Yeah.
There's
actually some in the Stanford article that I referenced for the beginning of the morality of suicide. That was one of the things that was mentioned, is what is suicide? What counts as suicide? You know,
Right.
does dying to save other people count as suicide? And some people would argue no, some people would argue yes. So I'm glad that you brought that up.
Yeah, so I think on a colloquial sense, the common use of the word, we mean someone who intentionally takes their lives for disparaging reasons. I think we can argue about the morality of giving a life, you know, giving up your life to save others.
Yeah. And we could argue over whether or not they're all suicide. I would argue from my own perspective, I simply understand suicide to be the taking of one's own life. And you could argue that, oh, well, maybe the person who jumped on the grenade, they weren't hoping to die. They didn't do it to die. They did it to save other people. And this byproduct of saving other people was that they would die from it. So they weren't actually really committing suicide. So, you know, but I would go with the deliberate killing of one's self.
I think that in one sense, I would agree that a rational human being who doesn't want to be a part of this world anymore has the right to do that.
Yeah.
I think it's fundamentally flawed, giving my worldview.
Right.
And there are fundamental issues with it. But if we talk about morality, we're usually talking about where we damage other people or other people
Yeah.
damage us and things. So I think it's a real hard area to kind of nail down whether it's immoral or not. I
Or
think
if it
that,
could be amoral but irrational, perhaps.
yeah,
There's a lot of nuance there.
yeah, there's, and there are people that commit suicide by way of not even taking care of themselves. They just don't care anymore.
Yeah.
And
Some people actually pick up bad habits like smoking just because of like, all right, now I'll die younger. And there's actually the Stanford article I just mentioned. That was another thing. They're like, well, does that count as suicide if they're doing it so they can die sooner?
yeah, and I've actually heard people say, now I don't know how much they believe it, but I've heard people say, I'm just going to keep drinking and smoking until I die. If it shortens my life, it's less shit I got to deal with.
Yeah, I've heard that a lot. So
yeah, so yeah, it is. It is. My thoughts overall is, it's hard to have a thought on it.
yeah,
It's a
definitely.
tough subject. There's so many different angles.
That's fair. And I realized as I asked you the question, I was like, man, that was a really vague question to kind of expect him to answer. So I felt bad right after the fact.
No,
I was
it's
like,
all
you know what?
good.
He's a philosopher. I'm gonna let him go for it.
Yeah, but I am a philosopher, but I'm also, I don't mean this in a technical term, but I'm more of a realist. I live in the world. I understand that everything's not as good as reading it in an article and on a book. We have, very complicated machines that we're dealing with, that we only understand such a small part about. So I would probably actually line up a lot along with you at this point.
Yeah.
Not we got to do a stream on assisted suicide. That's a different one and one I have a different opinion on altogether.
Right.
So
Makes sense. All right. Well, thank you so much for hopping on, Eddie. For those of you who tuned in later in, I would recommend if you would like to, at some point in the future, restart the stream, listen to what I covered in the beginning, because the overwhelming majority of this stream covered the rationality or irrationality of suicide. The morality or immorality was addressed in the first, I think it was mostly the first like 20 minutes. With that said, I'm Shane the Skeptic. This has been Eddie from brutefacts.com. You can check him out on YouTube. I think he has his website. I'm pretty sure that's what the .com stands for. So go check out his website. And for anyone experiencing dark times, suicidal thoughts, I would encourage you very much to reach out, whether that means reach out to me on Facebook or on the Discord server that I posted in the link, or if it means to reach out to people in other communities, people that you already know. But don't limit the people you reach out to necessarily to the people that you already know. Part of life is getting to meet new people. Like I said, you probably have some of the best friends in your life awaiting to meet you right now. So with that said, everybody, please have a good night. Stay safe. And
one second, Shane. I want you to pop this up here.
Yeah. Oh, I was also probably going to do the National Suicide Prevention.
There's the private chat. I sent you the suicide hotline.
Yeah, you know what? I have it in the description, but I'll say it here on air as well. While before I close out, if you are currently going through a dark time and experiencing suicidal thoughts, and you want to reach out, but you don't want to let people who know you personally that you're going through these thoughts, I know what that's like. Sometimes you're suicidal, you want to reach out for help, but you don't want to be a burden on people that you know. Well, there are people who talk to suicidal people who are in the position you're in right now. Either voluntarily or for a living. Different people do it differently. But you can call the National Suicide Prevention Hotline at 1-800-273-8255. That is 1-800-273-8255.
And real quick, they also have a chat on their site, and it's pure anonymity. They'll never find out who you are. You don't have to worry about them hunting you down and calling your family or anything. It's totally total anonymity.
Yep, I'm glad you got that out there too. With that said, everybody be safe, take care, and if you can get vaccinated and haven't yet, please get vaccinated. Take care.